Hey folks, welcome back to History and Politics Chat on Tuesday afternoons at 4 o'clock in my time zone. People keep asking me about when these happen, and I keep sort of cluelessly answering when they happen for me, not when they happen for you. And I would love to be able to do the math for you guys, and that's not my thing. I can do the history, I can't do the math surrounding time zones. That being said, let me give my usual disclaimer before I get down to the questions that you've sent today, which have taken on a really interesting pattern. My name is Heather Cox Richardson. I'm a professor of history and a professor of American history, and I do not speak for my employer. I only speak for myself when I do these talks. And again, I do not have a staff. I'm one person trying to make sense of the questions that people are asking about politics and history these days, and I'm doing it. The history I don't have a problem with. The technology behind this is a little bit harder for me, and that last week there was a break in the film, and we did fix it. If the same thing happens again this time around, know that I can see when the camera goes dead, and I will simply restart. So don't scramble if that happens again. All right, so let me get down to some of your questions today, which, as I say, took on some really interesting patterns. So what I'm going to do is, normally when I answer these questions, I try and do 4. I spend 15 minutes on each. And actually, your questions seemed to be, at first, all over the map, but there really was a pattern to them. So this is going to be less, here's question 1, here's question 2, here's question 3, and more, why don't we talk about some of the parallels between the past and the present? So that's what I'm going to do today. And let me start here. And I'm sorry to say that as I wrote down my outline for today, I try and carry your names along with you, along with the questions that people have asked. And for this particular question, the one that I wanted to start with, I dropped the person's name somewhere about 3rd draft. So I apologize for that, whoever asked this question. And the question was, is there any truth to voter fraud? Is voter fraud something we should be concerned about? And this is such a wonderful way into both modern day politics and American history. I couldn't resist starting with it. And it's going to be our lead off to everything else today. So is there any truth to voter fraud? No. I mean, simply no. If you look at any of the studies of voter fraud, you will see they come up empty-handed. What they do turn up is when people go door to door to register people to vote. Sometimes those people who do that registration are dishonest, and they will fill out a registration form with names like Daffy Duck or whatever. Obviously, Daffy Duck does not show up to vote, so you don't have to worry about that. The other thing that happens, and the reason that often voter rolls don't look like who actually shows up to vote, is because people move. That doesn't mean they vote at 2 addresses. That means simply that they might be on 2 rolls, even though they're only voting in one place. So the problem with voter fraud is actually vanishingly small, and every possible group that's gotten together to look into that will say that. They make a lot of hype about it, but they actually don't ever find anything. So let's talk about why voter fraud became a thing. And I'm going to start by talking about modern day America, and then I'm going to kick it back to the past and how that became such a big deal in the past, so that people could pick it up in the present. And let's start with the fact that Americans in the modern era begin to talk about voter fraud in about 1987. And I'm doing this off the top of my head here, so bear with me a little bit. They begin to talk about it in 1987, and they begin to do so right after, hold on, let me see if I can pull up a slide here. They begin to do, here we go. They begin to do so right after the Republicans start to worry about Ronald Reagan's tax cuts of 1986. They're concerned they're not going to be able to keep those tax cuts, because remember, at the beginning of the Reagan Revolution, it was not at all clear that the Republican Party, and certainly America in general, was going to wed itself to the idea of supply-side economics. Again, now it seems to be orthodoxy, but at the time, people were like, we're not so sure cutting taxes is a way to actually increase federal revenue. And the 1981 tax cut was was problematic enough, but the 1986 tax cut really worried a lot of people within the Republican Party because they thought that they would not be able to preserve that cut. So in 1986, there was a memo that came out, it actually came out later, but it was written in 86, about how if the Republicans advanced what they called ballot integrity measures, they would be able to reduce black voting in a certain election. It was not a national election, it was a state election, as I recall, either a state or a local election. And unfortunately for them, they wrote it down. They actually put it in writing, and there was a lawsuit over it, and it comes out. And the people in charge of it, and one of the people who's in charge of it, by the way, is now in the Trump administration, which is sort of interesting. I wrote about him last night. Said there is no way that, I think I wrote about him last night. I'm a little confused about when I wrote about certain things. There's no way that we actually meant to kick black people off the rolls. We simply want to be sure that the ballots are free and fair. And again, what they're trying to do is to make sure that they can keep hold of those 1986 tax cuts and some of the other things that went along with the Reagan Revolution. So they start to talk about ballot integrity. And then shortly after that, that's in 86, shortly after that, they begin to talk about how the only way that Democrats could possibly win is through somehow having illegal voters. And the way that this plays out is that after the Reagan, the beginning discussion of ballot integrity, the Republicans are really sort of horrified when Bill Clinton gets elected. And after he gets elected, one of the first things that the Democratic Congress does is it tries to pass, and it does pass, a new law that we know of as the motor voter law. And the motor voter law guarantees that people can register to vote in certain governmental offices. And most of us know that from our Department of Motor Vehicles or our Registry of Motor Vehicles. But by law, you could also register at other governmental offices, including welfare offices. And Republicans object to the motor voter law because what they say is that by expanding voter registration in this way, they would enroll what they called core Democratic constituencies, the ones who are in welfare and jobless benefits offices. So they see the expansion of voting then as a way of Democrats to pack their constituencies, if you will. After that, immediately after that, another Republican operative, again, who went and talked to the press, boasted that he had managed to win for one of his clients an election in a governor's election by suppressing the black vote there. And this is in 1994. So you've got this sort of rolling idea that if you manage to either increase voting, you would elect Democrats, or decrease voting and you would elect Republicans. So by 1994, after this, after the motor voter law especially, but then after Ed Rollins starts to talk, there is increasing language on the part of the Republicans that say that the only way Democrats are winning is through voter fraud. And in the election of 1996, there were two elections that year that in the House and the Senate, there was one in each, where the Republicans charged that the person who won had not in fact legally won, that they had won only through voter fraud. And they put together committees to look into what they allege is voter fraud. And they get out in front of the TV cameras again and again and again. And this is going to be leaders like Newt Gingrich saying the only way Republicans lose is when the Democrats can pack their cases with, or can pack their the elections with fake voters. And they say this again and again and again, and it goes, these investigations go on for months and months and months. And so all Americans are hearing on the news is the Democrats have cheated, there's voter fraud. Well, in both cases, there was no evidence. The committees disbanded without finding any evidence. This is, again, governance by committee, by making accusations and keeping the investigations open rather than by actually finding anything. And they both have to disband when there's no evidence. And what they do is they go in front of the cameras and they say, there was no evidence, but it's only because they all destroyed it. The evidence must have been there, but we couldn't find it. We know it was there. So this kind of plants the seeds of the idea that there is voter fraud going on. And then coming after that, there is in Miami in 1997, just a horrific, I shouldn't laugh, it's not horrific, but a mayoral election in which everybody's cheating. And it's really embarrassing. I mean, both sides end up getting indicted, and there's court cases, and it's pretty clear the whole thing's just been a complete sham. What's interesting about that, though, is that that there wasn't actually a Democrat in that race. It was a Republican and an independent, and it was all tangled up in Miami politics in a way that is way beyond me. It's a lot to do with Cuban immigrants and all kinds of stuff that is just a complete microcosm of Miami. But on the heels of that, Florida decides that it simply has to clean up the fraud that could have happened, or that happened in places like Miami. And so Florida passes a law to clean up its own voting. And when they do that, they put forth the idea that their voter rolls are corrupt at a state level, not at a Miami level, and that these have to be purged. And when they do that, they end up purging from the Florida voter rolls a number of people, as many as 100,000 people. Let me say that again, as many as 100,000 people who are presumed to be Democrats. They seem to be overwhelmingly African Americans. And I'm going to tell you how I know that in just a minute. Because this is going to matter a lot in just a minute. So obviously, you probably all know where this is going. So this is in the late 1990s. Florida passes this voter cleanup. But what it does is it manages to take about at least up to 100,000 people off the Florida voting rolls and keep them from voting. Well, why do we care about that? You must know where this is going. The election of 2000 is settled in Florida, and it comes down to a handful of votes in Florida, a few hundred votes in Florida, and everybody pays attention to those few hundred votes and the recount of those few hundred votes. But of course, had there not been this voter purge, and of course, had there not been the devastating butterfly ballot, which meant that a number of votes for Al Gore, the Democrat, were thrown away on far-right candidate Pat Buchanan, the outcome of the Florida election would have been very different. And that's, or at least one can assume it is. Of course, we can't rewrite history, but you lose 100,000, up to 100,000 Democratic voters before a key vote. It's reasonable to think that things might have been different had they gone ahead and voted. As an aside here, I just want to point out that that the reason that there isn't a Florida recount in 2000, a recount was underway, and we had what was known as the Brooks Brothers riot. And the Brooks Brothers riot was when a bunch of people came in from out of state and just basically stormed the area where the recount was taking place. And this is one of the things that shuts down the recount. And I just want to point out here a piece of news that just floored me, because at the time I didn't know who he was. The person in charge of that is Roger Stone, our Roger Stone, if you will. So this has been going a long way back. So then you get the idea that that voter suppression is, or that voter fraud really deeply gets into the concept of how Democrats or how Republicans are, and whenever a Republican loses, what they tend to argue is that I would not have lost had there not been voter fraud, had there not been these fake voters on the Democratic side. And you increasingly get this argument that the people who vote Democratic are cheating, that they shouldn't actually have the right to vote. And this is how you get, for example, from Trump's loss in the popular vote to him saying that he would have won the popular vote if there hadn't been fraudulent voting in New Hampshire and in California. Now, there is zero evidence of that. And as you might remember, he did in fact put together a commission to look into that fraud when he was first elected, and it very quietly closed its doors when it could not come up with anything. So is voter fraud real? No. It's a very deep part now of our political conversation, but is it real? No. So how did it gets such deep legs? And this is going to take us back to the 19th century, which is what a number of other people talked about asking questions, for example, like that of Judy Bohm-Wurges, who said, you know, I just reread, and I'm paraphrasing, by the way, I just reread Gone with the Wind, and she said she was sort of horrified by it. She hadn't read it since she was a teenager. I just want to point out that that was one of the books written during the Depression, and so it's like 6 million pages long. I don't know how you ever got through it. But anyway, in the Depression, books got way longer because people, I guess they wanted their money well spent if they were going to invest in a book. But I remember the first time I looked at that book and I thought, do people really read that? You know, it's like 6 million pages. Anyway, she said she was horrified by it, but what is the story in it about illiterate African Americans serving in public office and white people taking train loads of freedmen from voting booth to voting booth, having them vote many times? Is there any truth to this scenario? Well, that should sound really familiar after what I just told you. And one of the reasons that it echoes, that this Republican argument about voter fraud echoes, is because it is so deeply ingrained in our mythology of American democracy. So where does that myth come from in Gone with the Wind? And is it true? Once again, oh, I don't know. No. So you are going to get some voter fraud in the 19th century because there are really very few safeguards around voting in the 19th century. We really don't start to get safeguards until the midterm election of 1890. And I think I've talked about that here before. That's when we adopt the Australian ballot. And for the first time, the government actually makes its own voting booths. Until then, people had voted in saloons for the most part, actually, or in public spaces where there was really no oversight. So people could cheat. They could stuff ballot boxes, and they do. So there is that going on. But is it unique to the African American community? Absolutely not. So where do we get this idea? We get this idea because before the American Civil War, the elite Southern slave owners who are trying to defend why they are deliberately enacting policies that the majority of Americans hate. They say, we have to do this because the founders, in fact, were terrified of government by a mob. And if, in fact, we allowed our mudsills, as they call them, the workers in society to vote, they would vote to redistribute wealth. They would vote to have a bigger proportion of the wealth that they produce through their labor. And when they do that, that redistribution of wealth would mean that they would keep more of the wealth that they created, and society would essentially stop because slaveholders, the elite slaveholders, and you have to remember that most of the enslavers in the South had only 1 or 2 enslaved people. And their actual interests did not align with the large elite slave owners who tended to enslave more than 50 to 100 people and who were really ran the economy and society. So what by 1858, what elite slaveholders are saying is to Northerners who say, you know, we'd actually like the government to do something other than protect slavery. We'd like it to, you know, put a road across the Cumberland Gap so we can get out west. We'd like it to dredge harbors so that we don't keep dying by hitting sandbars and our ocean economy goes better. And we'd like it to actually do some stuff. And the Southern elites say, we don't care what you think it should do because the Constitution says that the government must be small, even if all of Americans want to do something. If the Constitution doesn't specifically say so, doesn't matter, they can't do it. And then, as I say, in 1858, James Henry Hammond, a South Carolina elite slaveholder, stands up on the floor of Congress and he really lays it out for Northerners. And he says, you know, you talk about democracy and you talk about equality, but we're the ones who figured it out because you're crazy. If you let workers and poor people start to have a say at the ballot box, they're going to destroy your society because they're going to demand more of a say of the things that they produce. And that's going to lead them to elect people who promise them, you know, programs to do stuff like dredge your harbors. And when they do that, he doesn't actually use the example of dredging harbors, by the way, if anybody's fact checking me here, but this is his gist. He's actually talking about something else. if you let them do that, what you are going to do is you're going to create a redistribution of wealth. And they're going to take money from elite people like us. And we're the ones really who are smart enough to move society forward and have the money and the means and the connections to do so really efficiently. So if you let them do that, they're going to destroy your society by leveling. They're going to put money back in their own pockets. And we're not going to have elite people like me, as he says, who are going to move society forward. Well, this obviously sets off a lot of hackles across the North, where they think it would be just a ducky idea for people at the bottom to have more of the wealth that they're producing. And Abraham Lincoln answers James Henry Hammond in 1859 in a speech at the Milwaukee Agricultural Fair, in which he says, that's one way to look at society, the idea that a few rich people, rich men he's talking about, move it forward. But I don't believe that. I believe in a system called free labor. And free labor means that the real power of society belongs at the bottom. We really need for the government to support the people at the bottom by doing things like dredging harbors or dredging the river outside of New Salem, which silted in and therefore destroyed Abraham Lincoln's first attempt at business. We need the government to do stuff that the rest of us can't do on our own. And we need that because the real power in society and the real brain power and the real muscle in society comes from people at the bottom, comes from entrepreneurs, comes from little guys who are hungry and who are going to come up with new ways to do stuff because they're not fat and lazy. And he doesn't use the terms fat and lazy, but they're not fat and lazy like the guys at the top who are stuck in their old traditional ways. They're the innovators. And by the way, aside here, Lincoln is the only US president to hold a patent. He invented something. They're innovators, they're hard workers, and they're the ones who sort of crowdsource new ideas. And that's where we need to put our efforts. Well, so you have these two very different ideas about the way society moves. Does it move forward by putting power at the top among a small elite group, or does it move by have the government putting its weight behind people at the bottom and giving them equality of opportunities so they can innovate and they can create stuff and they can work hard and create wealth that helps to power the economy? Well, so how am I getting to voter fraud here? So that when Abraham Lincoln becomes president in 1860 and immediately faces the American Civil War and the secession of Confederate states, the Republican Party immediately begins to put in place a government that responds to the will of the people. And we get, as I've said a million times before here, we get not only the Homestead Act, which puts people directly on land, the government puts people directly on Western land that once again belongs to indigenous peoples, but the idea, of course, is to create wealth at the bottom. It creates state universities under the Land Grant College Act, a major, major deal that says it's worth investing in our poor men as well as in our rich men. Previously, education was limited to men whose dads could afford to send them to elite universities. It creates the Department of Agriculture to make sure that people have access to good seeds. There's no seed catalogs in the 1860s. It creates new national money to guarantee that bankers aren't in charge of money, but that in fact everybody is backing our American currency. It makes people, or lets people, invest in bonds. It makes the government's finances depend on regular Americans so that they're no longer beholden to bankers. And it charters the Union Pacific Railroad to guarantee that people can get to Western lands and to the mines where they can literally pull gold out of the ground. So it does all these things, but it also does something major beyond all that. And that is that the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln during the American Civil War invents American taxation for the first time. For the first time in American history, we get national taxation, including income taxes under the federal government. That's the first time we've had them. The War of 1812 is actually apportioned very differently. It's apportioned according to state. So now for the first time we have federal taxation. Lincoln's policies are enormously popular. People love that the government belongs to them and it's doing things that they like. Of course, the other major assumption of power that the Republican Party takes on during the war is the end of chattel slavery. Except there's slavery as punishment for crime, a loophole you can drive an army tank through, but there is no longer systemic slavery in America after the ratification of the 13th Amendment in immediately after the war. So we're all good, right? We can all go home and have a new society and call it done. Well, obviously not, because immediately what happens after the war is Democrats, of course, Lincoln is a Republican, and his political party that puts all this stuff into place is the Republican Party. And immediately after the war, Democrats who hate this say, wait a minute, these taxes are destroying us. No, the taxes actually weren't destroying them. There are other things that were problematic for workers in American society at the time. Primarily, that real wages hadn't increased during the war, and there had been extreme inflation. But that's kind of, as I say, a rabbit hole to go down. But what they began to say is that Republicans are taking tax dollars. And why are they taking tax dollars? Well, who is the Republican Party helping immediately after the Civil War? Well, in the summer of 1865, we get across the South the rise of gangs, for example, that are preying on African Americans. Even more than that, though, we get the fact that in the process of trying to establish free labor in the South, the ability for African Americans to work and make money and join an economy in which they actually employ their labor for their own survival, as opposed to being enslaved. When that happens, the former enslavers, the white former masters, cheat the African Americans. They don't pay them their wages. They take their property. They attack them. They assault them. They rape their wives. They murder people. And it's a bad time across the South. The police systems have broken down, and people are depressed, and their loved ones are dead, and they are starving. They're literally starving because the war ends in the spring, and nobody's been able to plant anything. And spring's always a crappy time on the farms anyway, because there's not much to eat yet. And in the midst of all this, there's a problem for African Americans to redress any of these problems, because under the black codes that Southern legislatures pass in the summer of 1865, African Americans can't testify in court. Well, if you can't testify in court and you can't sue anybody, and you don't know anybody on the jury, you basically are a sitting duck for what anybody wants to do to you. And when that happens, African Americans go to the officers of the Freedmen's Bureau, which is a bureau put in place under the branch of the Army. It's actually in the War Department at the time. It's not in the Interior, which is where one might have thought to put it. But Congress put the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands quite deliberately in the War Department to emphasize that it was not going to be a long-term program. By the way, us oldsters out there, one of the words they used all the time was eleemosynary, which anybody who remembers Nixon will know. For some reason, Nixon loved that word. The rest of you can all forget about that word, because that's the only other time I've heard it, is in 1865 and under Nixon, and maybe at a spelling bee. Anyway, they wanted to prove that it was not going to be a lifetime, a permanent department, so they put it under the War Department. So the Democrats begin to say, wait a minute, our tax dollars, the tax dollars that are supporting this army in the South, are using those tax dollars to give benefits to African Americans, because the Freedmen's Bureau officers decide in favor of African Americans when they come to them to complain about 68% of the time, according to the best study we have, which is a study that was done in Texas. They probably should have more, but they look at that and they say, wait a minute, your tax dollars are going to provide benefits for African Americans. I mean, you might even say that your tax dollars are being redistributed to help African Americans. Well, this concept gets picked up by Andrew Johnson, President Andrew Johnson, who takes over from Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln's assassination. And in 1866, when Congress tries to expand the Freedmen's Bureau to establish federal courts where African Americans can testify, and also passes a law to give African Americans a civic identity. These are two separate laws. Johnson vetoes both of them, and he says, you can't do this. You can't do this because this amounts to redistributing wealth from white people to black people, because you're giving black people rights that no white person has. You don't specify white men in any of these laws. Well, of course they don't. All the laws are written for white men. But by specifying black men, you are giving black men a leg up that white people don't have. And you are you're paying for this active government through tax dollars. And this is a tax on hardworking white men to support African American men. They're not really talking about women at this point at all. Well, okay, that's Johnson. It's still not, hasn't really caught on, because Johnson is enormously unpopular among Republicans in the North. So where does it go from there? In 1871, remember, African Americans still can't vote in what I'm talking about. In 1870, though, this equation is going to change with the 15th Amendment, when African American men get the right to vote. And with African American men getting the right to vote, one of the things that happens is that the South Carolina legislature becomes a majority African American legislature, which reflects the population in South Carolina. But when that happens, immediately white taxpayers in South Carolina organize, and they insist that the Republican legislators in South Carolina are deliberately using tax dollars to put in place programs that benefit African Americans, like roads and schools and hospitals and orphan asylums, lots of orphans after the Civil War. And by putting those programs in place, and programs that must be paid for with tax levies, what they are doing is they are literally taking the money of hardworking white men and redistributing it to African Americans. This becomes known as socialism. It's a very famous article written in 1871 called Socialism in South Carolina. Now you look at it nowadays and you think, isn't that what the government is supposed to do? Provide basic services to the people who live within its borders. But at the time they said, no, this is based obviously in the racism of the pre-war years, and obviously continuing into the post-war years. But what they are saying is, by letting poor people vote, you are essentially creating socialism. And by 1871, as I've talked about elsewhere, this is also going to be called communism because of the Paris Commune. You're creating a socialism or communism that will destroy American society. And worse, in their minds, is the fact that that money is going to go from white people to black people. So by 1871, you have in America this linkage of the idea of poor people voting with the idea that they are creating an illegitimate socialist government. That is going to balloon over the course of the 19th century until you get the idea that African American voting itself, even if it is done all according to the rules, is illegitimate, because African Americans are going to be voting for people who will provide programs that are useful for them. And as I say, in the 19th century, this means roads and hospitals and schools overwhelmingly. But white taxpayers say, we don't have any interest in being taxed to pay for these things. And therefore, the people who are voting really for themselves. You might even say, as they do by 1874, they are a special interest. This is special interest legislation. And this is antithetical to the whole idea of an American polity in which we are all in it together. And so and I'm just skipping ahead a little bit here, by the 1890s, you have Republicans who by then are unhappy about poor voting themselves because they don't like immigrant voting, talking about voter fraud and beginning to say that there is no legitimacy to a government if it is in place according to, because poor people have voted for it. And you have a couple of dramatic times on the floor of Congress where people are actually threatening a revolution, saying that the good man, the best man in this country will not put up with being ruled by you people, by these poor people at the bottom of society. And this has a few really dramatic outcomes in American history in the 1880s and the 1890s. And when you have cases, especially in Cincinnati, where a number of people storm a jail and take out two men who've been accused of murder, one African American and one white man, who've killed their employer, apparently. I wasn't there. And they say that they're not going to get actual justice because the voters have elected judges who are going to let them off, and that those people are beholden to the voters who put them in office. And as a result, for true justice, the only way to get true justice is to take these guys out and lynch them, which they lynched the African-American man. I don't remember if they get the white guy or not. But I talked about this last week as well. The same thing happens in the Johnson County War and the Coeur d'Alene strike in 1892 out west, where in both cases, the popular will was on the side of the small farmers in the case of one, and on the miners in the case of the other. And in both cases, even though those things were, those situations were legitimately put in place, the rich people were able to say, we don't care if these people were legitimately elected. They shouldn't be voting. And this comes to a head really dramatically in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, when we get a coup in which a government in the town was elected by populists and Republicans, and it was legitimately elected, and there is no doubt that it was legitimately elected. But the Democrats in town get rid of it. They come in with guns, and they say that they didn't have to be violent because all the people who'd been elected knew they were illegitimate and that they didn't know how to govern. Mind you, a number of them were killed in the process of acknowledging that. But they come in and they say, we don't care that they were elected. They're not governance material. They need to get out of here, and we will never again be ruled by black people. They come out and say that, and that's known as the Wilmington Riot or the Wilmington Coup of 1898. When even though it is a legitimate government, they say it's fraudulent because these people should not be voting. So that is that construction of the idea that people who vote in favor of government policies that benefit people at the bottom of society, who in our society have tended to be people of color and or women, that they are illegitimate voters, that true Americans would not vote for such policies because those are anti-American, or after 1871, they are called communist or socialist, which is how you can have today people like Mitch McConnell talking about how he is deliberately stopping all of what he calls the communist legislation coming from the House of Representatives. This is not communism. It's just an American term. Communism is a system of government under which the government actually owns the means of production. And we are so far from that. It's mind-boggling to hear anybody talking about communism. But what they are talking about is this equation of poverty and race and gender that has been struggling for a voice in American society since the Civil War. All right. That's a lot on voter fraud, but I snuck a couple of questions in there when you guys weren't looking. So, because I wanted to do them all kind of in a group. All right, so quickly then I'm going to do a couple of short ones because I want to get to a longer question as well. Short ones that apply to this as well. Sarah Wilson asked, why is the Department of Justice within the executive branch rather than within the judicial branch? And boy, is that a great question, isn't it, Sarah? Like, it does actually have the word justice in it, which is the same root as the word judicial. Why on earth is it in the executive branch? It's in the executive branch because of history, right? It's everything because of history. The Attorney General's office is created by the Judiciary Act of 1789. In fact, although this Constitution sets up the branches, it really doesn't say much at all about what the judges are supposed to do. And what we really look for as our touchstone to what the judiciary is supposed to do is the Judiciary Act of 1789. And the job of the Attorney General was initially expected it would be a part-time job. And the Attorney General was supposed to give advice to Congress as well as to the President. And quickly, of course, this becomes too much for any person to do both. And in 1819, the Attorney General begins to advise Congress alone, although it remains in the executive branch. We get the establishment, by the way, of the White House Council during World War II in 1943, the establishment of the White House Council. And the White House Council is supposed to give advice to the President, as opposed to being the person in charge of defending the U.S. government, which is the the AG. Anyway, so when did we get the Department of Justice? Remember, I didn't say anything yet about the Department of Justice. The Department of Justice is part of the whole story I just told you. It is formed to reinforce the idea of Black rights across the South. It's clear after 1865, 1866 that white Democrats in the South want no part of equality for African Americans. So Congress begins to start discussing the idea of creating a new department for that in 1867, and that is in part because Andrew Johnson is still president, and it's clear that he can do an awful lot because as commander-in-chief of the army, he can order around what's going to happen down there. And until 1868, the Southerns, the 10 remaining Southern states, Tennessee comes in much earlier for a complicated reason, but we still have 10 unreconstructed Southern states in 67 when they're beginning to talk about it, and they're talking about putting in place something that will guarantee Black rights. When Grant becomes president in 1868, he gets behind the idea. He signs the law creating the Department of Justice in June of 1870, and he does so because, for a number of reasons, but one of the things that's happening by 1870 is this backlash against Black voting. And the Black voting, it's not just Black voting, it's actually the KKK rises in the summer of 1868 to try and stop the ratification of Southern constitutions. That's a rabbit hole I won't take you down. But what happens is you get the real rise of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which is a terrorist organization in the South of white people masquerading as former Confederates. Initially, they were supposed to represent the ghosts of former Confederates. That's why they wear the stupid white sheets. And they're actually not standardized white sheets at the time. The KKK is trying to stop Republican voters, white as well as Black, but of course primarily Black voters in the South beginning after 1868. The KKK is kind of really running wild in especially South Carolina by 1870, and Grant appoints around about then a new attorney general. I don't remember the exact date. His name is Amos Ackerman, Amos T Ackerman. I actually had the great privilege of doing something with a man who's writing a biography of him. And let me tell you, there are people out there who love Amos T Ackerman. And Amos T Ackerman was actually quite a cool dude, because what he does is when Congress in 1871 passes a law known as the KKK Act, giving Grant extraordinary powers to go after the KKK, what Grant does is he suspends habeas corpus in 9 counties in South Carolina. And when that happens, Ackerman personally leads U.S. Marshals into the countryside where his life is worth spit, let me tell you. And he makes arrests, and he arrests an awful lot of people. About 2,000, as I recall, Klansmen run to other counties. They run out of South Carolina. And he prosecutes over 1,000 Klansmen and gets 600 convictions of Klansmen in this period, which is no small potatoes considering that the man was working largely on his own. Pretty impressive thing. But so the Department of Justice is in that case under the Attorney General, and the Attorney General is in the executive department, and Congress is perfectly happy to leave it there because in this period, the executive is the branch that is overseeing Reconstruction. So it's a Reconstruction story. All right, now I wish I knew which of these questions you people would most like to hear more about in these last 15 minutes. I'm going to do a real quickie here. You know what I actually am going to do? I'm going to jump forward, and then I'm going to end with something longer. I hope this explains to you, 3 people actually asked about the American healthcare system. Why on earth doesn't America have healthcare when, I don't know, every other developed country in the world does? Why it doesn't have national healthcare? And someone said, don't you care about your people? Renee Tetrick said, how did the American healthcare system come to be the way it is? Who benefits? How did this happen? I hope what I have just laid out does some explaining for you there. In fact, There has been talk on the table of there being an American healthcare system since Teddy Roosevelt in 1912, when he campaigned on a platform in 1912. It's a Bull Moose platform, not the Republican platform, because he's going to split the Republican Party that year. But he runs as a Bull Mooser on a platform that includes a single national health service. And this is significant because by 1912, Teddy Roosevelt has switched the concept of what it means to be a liberal, what liberalism means. Because liberalism traditionally means, traditionally as in the 19th century, and before that, the 18th century, it means that the government needs to be kept small so it doesn't crush the individual. What Teddy Roosevelt does is he flips that script and he says, in an era of consolidation and industrialization, the federal government needs to be large in order to protect the individual, because the government has to be strong enough to stand against these large conglomerates. When he says that, and when he realizes that there is this major ideological shift that needs to take place in the American government, one, we're going to get the progressive era, but two, we're going to get him calling for a number of things: food and drug regulation, for example, cleaning up the cities, making sure people get education, having labor laws, and of course, finally having a healthcare system. And the pushback against any kind of, I can't resist, eleemosynary, just kidding, any kind of public benefit legislation like that, is that people insisted right away that it was socialism or communism. And of course, by the time he loses the election in 1912, and of course by 1917 we have the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, and that cry of communism gets even more teeth than it had had before. FDR tries to resurrect the idea of a national healthcare system, but critics instantly complain that it is socialist, especially people from the American Medical Association, who stand to lose, they think, prestige, power, and pay when that happens. And again, you see this again and again and again. Finally, one of my favorite stories is that Dwight Eisenhower tries to resurrect it in 1954. He had actually tried to come up with some kind of a system under his new Secretary of Health and Human Services, Nelson Rockefeller, who goes on to become governor of New York, could have been president if he hadn't had that problem with his zipper. He goes on to say, to try and propose a National Health Care Act, but he's not going to be able to get anything through because of the fact that Democrats look at this and they say, we don't want to give benefits to Black people. Why would we want to do that? So once again, this idea splits on the rock of Americans not wanting to spread public largesse to people at the bottom of the scale, because those people tend to be people of color. I'm going to stop going on about that now because I think most of you probably remember the most of this. I will point out that there is, in fact, a dramatic expansion of Medicare and Medicaid, which we get under LBJ, Lyndon Baines Johnson, who's a Democrat, in the 60s. We get the major expansion of that under George W. Bush, who gives us Medicare Part D. So there is increasingly an emphasis on expanding healthcare, but always the idea of coming up with a universal healthcare system breaks on the rock of the idea that it is somehow socialism, that is going to give tax dollars to lazy people. And that is a construction that comes straight out of Reconstruction, even though it is an incredibly popular thing. All right, I wanted here to talk more about how Republicans and Democrats change sides, which is another question people ask, but I'm going to run out of time, so I'm not going to talk about that. I want to take on two other things because I think they'll be of interest to people right now. 3 people also asked me what I thought about, where did it go? What I thought about the accusations, I can't find it now, the accusations against Joe Biden by, I'm trying to find her name, I'm sorry, and I can't find it. The accusations by, I'm looking to see if somebody's going to tell me what her name is. You guys are all chatting over there about historical stuff. Why won't somebody help me out with this woman's name? Here we go. What's my latest? Andy Bruner asked, what is my take on the latest corroboration of Tara Reade's allegation? How might it affect the election? Fascinating question, and I'm going to be too quick with it simply because I want to get to the last question, which is really interesting. What is my take on it? My take is that every single one of these allegations should always be investigated. That is non-negotiable for me. That being said, I'm going to walk you through how I'm thinking about this. That being said, there is only one person accusing him right now, and that is problematic for making a case, simply because usually sexual assaulters have patterns, and in this case, and I'm trying to choose my words carefully, you can see, in this case, Joe Biden is very much a known entity. He's been vetted 16 ways from Sunday. If you think Barack Obama would have put him on a ticket without knowing every single bone of every single skeleton in his closet, you did not watch the Obama administration, because they were so careful about everything. So my guess is this, when it is investigated, might find out not to have a lot of teeth, simply because of the area surrounding it. Now, I have not read any of the allegations, and I won't, because I'm looking at the larger pattern here. I did look at the fact it's been corroborated and all that, and the dates of when that happened. Now, but here's the other piece that's really interesting to me, looking at it as a large pattern. And that is that this is going to be a real hard one for the Republicans to make stick, because, of course, Donald Trump has been creditably accused of sexual assault by, I think it's 16 women at this point. And he has been on tape talking about sexual assault. So for the Republicans to make this stick on Joe Biden is going to be very difficult, it seems to me, because the obvious answer is, yeah, well, let's talk about those 16 things. What you will see, though, is it being amplified by Russian disinformation and by people on the left who dislike Joe Biden, because they've got nothing to lose. And that one thing that I wanted to go from here was to talk about what you do as this upcoming election season happens. How do you know what to take seriously? Because we're going to be flooded with disinformation. And what I would say to begin with is, of course, always check credible sources, because so many of you send me stuff that you're like, what is this about? You know, this whole thing about the incorporation of Washington, D.C. in 1871. Is it true we don't have a government? No, it's not. That's nuts, you know? So check and see where that information comes from. And someday maybe I'll do something with that. It's a really interesting conspiracy theory, but oh, come on. But in this, so always take a look at where the sources come from. But even that, come on, use common sense. Is she credible? I don't know. Do I think she should be listened to? 100%. Wouldn't you say that if you were the person in charge of this? But who is it? You know, is it somebody nobody's ever heard of? In that case, I would give it more credibility, because who knows? The person hasn't been vetted. In the case of somebody who was in the Obama administration, vice president, you know, they vet these people incredibly carefully. You know, it all came to the surface, or there's just no way it wouldn't. So that being said, I mean, why else would Trump want to manufacture something on Biden if he had something that he could use? So that's my take on that, and who knows how. You know, I may end up eating these words, but my gut says this is not the same category as the things that we're hearing about Trump. That's what my gut says. My gut could be wrong, because we don't know what the future looks like. All those caveats, but this to me is not something I'm going to be spending a lot of time on until I hear a lot more about it. People sling stuff at the wall to see what sticks. Doesn't feel to me like this is sticking, in part because the Republicans can't make hay out of this. All right, next and final question, and that comes from a number of you, but Philip Cross put it best, I think. about where do I stand on the age-old American dilemma of states' rights versus a strong federal government. Well, this is the central question of where we are right now in American society, right? And that's not I don't really need to answer that. I have some ideas about it, of course. But the real question we're grappling with is, what is the proper relationship between the federal government and its citizens? There are people among us who believe that the federal government should do nothing but protect property, as the Constitution demands that it do, and protect us overseas. So we need a strong military. I disagree with that because I believe that when you leave society that way, or when the government acts only in that way in the modern world, what happens is that wealth invariably accumulates at the very top. And I have in my support some of the founders who recognize that that is precisely what happened the minute the 13 colonies began to expand across the Appalachian Mountains into Kentucky. When they thought that Western land would guarantee that every man had rights, what they discovered in Kentucky was, in fact, slave owners moved there, monopolized the land, became very wealthy, monopolized the political system, and drove all the poor people out. So after they recognized that that was the case, the founders, some of the founders, went ahead and passed the under the Articles of Confederation, passed the Northwest Ordinance. And the Northwest Ordinance outlawed primogeniture, which meant that the oldest son didn't take everything because they didn't want to have concentration of wealth. But it also outlawed slavery in lands above the Ohio River, because they worried that the concentration of power would destroy democracy, that the government needed to guarantee that it had a finger on the scale to make sure that rich people didn't take everything. And so I feel like I'm in pretty good company on that one. And of course, it was Abraham Lincoln who made that case before the Civil War, based on his experiences in the Northwest Territories, which were states by then, and Illinois and Indiana is what I'm talking about in the case of Lincoln, and insisted that the government should be a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Well, so where are we right now with these Western governors making a pact to work together in the reopening of America after COVID, and the Northeastern states doing the same? I am fascinated by this because we, of course, have had in the past in America secession movements, not just the Southern states trying to destroy the Union in 1861, but also in 1815 we had the Hartford Convention, which happened after, well, during really the War of 1812. And with the War of 1812, the people in charge of the federal government, and they were known as Democratic Republicans at the time, and this would be Thomas Jefferson first as president and then James Madison second as presidents, put in place policies that really destroyed New England. They put in place embargoes that made it impossible for the mariners of the New England states to trade with France and England. And it really just drove the New England into a depression. And this is why you see these great big beautiful Federalist homes in places like the coastline in Maine was Massachusetts at the time, and then there's nothing for a long time. That's because of the embargo acts in the early Federalist period. And the Federalists here in New England decided that they didn't want any part of this government. So they actually held a convention from December through mid-December through January of December 1814 to January of 1815, in which they said, we don't want to be part of this anymore. We want there to be some amendments to the Constitution saying you can't pull crap like this. And what they really were doing was they didn't really want to secede. They actually made sure the real radicals weren't part of the whole convention, but they wanted to put pressure on the federal government to go ahead and make some concessions to them. And they showed up in Washington to push their plan right after news broke of the fact that Andrew Jackson had won the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, and they looked like just utter weenies. So the whole idea, everyone paid no attention to them, and the idea of seceding in that case looked stupid. Then you get the idea of Southern states to want to secede in 1861. There again, they're trying to pressure the federal government to make concessions to them. And just to make sure I make my timeline here, what's interesting is after the New Deal and the liberal consensus, the idea that the government really should take care of its people and should have a basic social safety net and regulate business and promote infrastructure. After that, you do get the rise of the movement conservatives who take over the Republican Party, insisting on secession. They don't want the government to tell them how to live. And you see this dramatically with the rise of the use of the Confederate flag after the Brown v. Board of Education decision in 1954, enforcing desegregation. You see it through increasing language about how the federal government is the problem, not the solution, as Ronald Reagan says. And the sort of conclusion of that, if you will, although we're not to the end of it, is the increasing sort of radicalization of people on the right, people like Cliven Bundy and the Bundy sons who had the standoff at the Malheur National Wildlife Refuge, saying that they don't want to be part of the federal government, that the federal government has overreached. But what's really interesting about this moment with these North and with the Westerners and the Easterners making these pacts is, first of all, they are centered around states that are enormously wealthy. So this isn't a poor group of people saying your policies are hurting us. This is a very wealthy group of people saying we have shared interests. And they are not standing up against the federal government at all. They very deliberately picked their issue, which is, of course, the issue on the table. It's not like they went and invented it, but they picked the issue of state health care, of taking care of their states, which is a power that resides in the states. And what they simply said is, we're going to cooperate on this piece of things that the federal government says it doesn't want to do. And Trump quite, maybe inadvertently played into that by saying, this is you states take this over. They said, okay, we'll take that over. And it's going to be, we're in this really interesting moment because they're not talking about secession. But there is a threat there, I think, an implied threat of these very wealthy states saying, hey, look, we have an awful lot of things in common. And all of them have made a point of saying, we're going to govern by science and advice by experts, not by ideology. That's a really important thing they've all said. And they've said, we have a lot in common, and we'd like to help our people. And we're not talking about seceding from the federal government. We're talking about taking the power you said was ours. And I think there is an implied threat in that to the federal government, because if they did push that further, and I'm not saying they're going to, what would somebody like John Kennedy from Louisiana say? He's been talking about how the federal government is too strong for years. They've all been saying the federal government needs to back off. The states need to be able to do what they're going to do. Well, of course, they were doing that to empower the Republican Party. But these governors have flipped that on their head, and they're using it to empower the Democratic Party and their states. And this is an entirely different equation than we had at the Hartford Convention or in the secession ordinances, or what you're seeing from Cliven Bundy saying, you guys back off. These states are not saying you guys back off. They're saying, well, you didn't want to do it, I guess we will. And this is a really interesting ideological moment, and one where you really want to start to grapple with, what do you think? Should the federal government be acting for these people at the bottom? Or should it continue to make money move upward in order to create a ruling class that is not going to get, it's going to be well educated, it's going to have money, it's going to have connections, they're going to have connections all over the world. Is that what we want? Is that what you want? Or do you believe, as I do, in Lincoln's version of democracy that says that real innovation comes from the bottom? It comes from giving opportunities to regular people like you and me who have good ideas and who are willing to work together to solve the country's problems. Those are the questions that are on the table when we talk about states' rights versus the federal government. There are ideologies, strong traditional ideologies on both sides, and it's up to you guys to decide what you think about them and to try and take the country that direction. All right, best I can do for this week. There was a question I didn't get to. Maybe we'll pick it up next week. Thank you very much. Hope this was useful. And if so, I will see you on next Tuesday talking about questions. And if you're interested in the history of this, on Thursday at 1 o'clock my time, who knows what time it is your time, we will continue to pick up the story of the progressive era in the 20th century, loosely following the outline in my new book, How the South Won the Civil War, Democracy, Oligarchy, and the Continuing Fight for the Soul of America. Thank you very much. I'll see you next week.